In today's episode, we're going to be test fitting this coilover on my E36 M3 track car to get an idea for what size wheel spacers we're going to need. I've been reading that when you install KW coilovers on these cars that you end up running into tire and wheel fitment issues. They end up rubbing on these springs, and before I pull the trigger and buy spacers, I want to figure out what spacers I'm going to need. I think that's the better approach. And not only that, but we're also going to be making the E36 M3 a bit more stiff than it was prior to today's episode with what I think is the best bang for buck mod you could do to one of these cars when it comes to tightening their chassis. So enough talking, let's get into the episode. Here we go. Now, in case you're not caught up to speed, here's a quick rundown. I'm building a race car. Now, it's not going to be a full-on dedicated track car, at least not yet. Right now, the goal is simple. A fun, bearable off-track car that's also highly capable when it does finally hit the track. And in an effort to reach that goal, I've been prepping my E36 M3 to take on that challenge. Now, a few episodes ago, I showcased the suspension I'm planning to run on this car. A set of KW Clubsport coilovers paired with Eibach rear springs fit with H&R tender springs. And in that episode, I began the tear down and refresh of the suspension parts as this kit was bought used and was in need of some deep cleaning. But very soon after starting that project, I ran into a problem. Some of the pieces on one of the front coilovers were severely damaged and no longer usable, which meant that not only was I unable to finish refreshing all of the parts, but it also meant that I've been unable to install the new suspension on the M3. But thankfully, all the parts I need to finish the refresh are on order and have been since I put that episode together. But if you do the math, that means I've been waiting nearly 2 months for parts that I was told would take only 3 or 4 weeks to land at my front door. So, in an attempt to make light of the situation, as well as give myself some much needed motivation to keep this build going, today we're going to test fit the seemingly undamaged and refreshed front coilover to take some measurements and get an idea for everything I'll need to make the install as smooth and simple as possible once the parts from KW do finally arrive. And if you haven't already, I'd greatly appreciate if you consider subscribing to the channel. It's the best way to support the work that I put into each of these episodes, and I also have a feeling you're not going to want to miss when the suspension parts do finally arrive, because those are some of the last parts I'm waiting on to have everything I need to get the M3 dialed for its very first track day. And if you don't want to miss that, then you definitely don't want to forget to follow along. So with that being said, let's get back into the episode. Now, just a reminder, I'm only test fitting one of the front coilovers today, which does mean that by the end of this episode, I will be going back to the OEM suspension. So in an attempt to try to keep those of you who are watching entertained and potentially share my feeling of accomplishment by having actually installed something permanent into the car, in today's episode, I'm going to be installing this factory X-brace that I picked up a few months back, which, similar to the coilovers, I also bought secondhand, which means that it's also going to need a bit of refreshing, which is where this episode actually begins. Now, I mentioned in the suspension refresh episode that the KW coilovers were well loved, or as some might say, used and abused, and the broken parts definitely help paint that picture. However, this X-brace, despite having no obvious signs of damage, is still in need of a good once-over. Now, just for a bit of context, to my knowledge, these originally came equipped onto the E36 convertibles, as those cars in particular weren't as stiff due to not having a built-in roof bracing either side of the car. So BMW gave those cars this X-brace to try and make up the difference. However, it's been the go-to mod for anyone trying to improve the overall driving feel of their E36, vert or not, pretty much since their development by BMW, and that's exactly why I bought one. Not only are these oftentimes a fraction of the cost of buying new when you find them used, but it's been mentioned on more than a few forum groups that this is one of, if not the best bang for buck chassis tightening mods you could do to one of these cars. Now, really quick before I actually install the X-brace for good, and before I clean it up a bit, I do think it's a smart idea to try and test fit it before I really get into cleaning and ultimately repainting this part, because again, I did buy it used, and so on the off chance that the holes don't line up or if the part is bent in some weird way, I want to be able to fix it while it's still beat up and dirty looking, as opposed to having to redo some paint work because I decided not to check first and find out that maybe it didn't fit like I had thought. So because I'm going to be crawling underneath the M3 for both the X-brace install and to test fit the KW front coilover, I have to get the M3 up in the air, which means I get to show off a new tool that I was recently gifted. Now in the past, I've always used the floor jack that belongs to my roommate, and while it does work and oftentimes is plenty for what I need it for, Lately, with the amount of work I've done underneath the M3, it's become painfully clear that I need a bit more room. And without breaking the bank and picking up something like quick jacks, for now, the next best tool for the job is this 3-ton Daytona Harbor Freight jack that gives me the capacity of raising my cars over 20 inches off the ground, which is more than enough for what I have planned to do in today's episode. Now I get it. I also share your feelings if you're thinking to yourself, it's a bit silly to sit here and unbox a tool that I probably should have purchased prior to even starting this channel. And I also think it's probably a tool every other car enthusiast has likely already owned for several years at this point. However, despite that, this is my very first floor jack, and it's a tool I've been excited to get for a while now, so you're just gonna have to bear with me for a moment while I appreciate having a new tool that's going to make working on my cars that much more simple and smooth until I can afford something a bit more useful. Alright, new tools out of the way, it's time to focus back on today's plans. Now like I said, I'm going to test fit the X-Brace first so I can be sure that it doesn't need work prior to cleanup and paint work. So let's get under the car and see how it fits. You know, it's sort of ironic that the car still isn't high enough to really film very well down here, but nonetheless, after a few cramped B-roll clips, we can see that the X-Brace does fit perfectly, which means it's finally time to clean it up and prep it for paint. Now, at this point, truth be told, I've not done much other than showing off my new tool and talk a bit about this X-Brace, so I'm going to save us both the time and only briefly go over this next step, as the coilover install coming up ended up being a lot more worthwhile than I anticipated, and I want to get over to that. So to start the X-Brace prep for paint, I've removed all of the stickers with the heat gun, cleaned all of the dust, dirt, grime, and oil off of it, and once it was dried, hung it in my backyard so I can finally get it painted. And without wanting to get too wild, especially considering no one will ever see this part other than myself, I stayed a bit on the relaxed side and opted to paint the X-Brace matte black. But now that the X-Brace is officially drying, we could finally get into the important part of the episode. Now, just as a reminder in case anyone forgot what this episode aims to accomplish, I'm going to be installing my recently refreshed and in working order KW Clubsport coilover onto the passenger front corner of the car to get a measurement of the space needed in order to get my wheel and or tires to clear the KW coilover. So let me get the old suspension out so I can toss the Clubsport coilover in, and then we can talk about what's going to need to happen. Now, I have to admit, seeing even just this one coilover installed in the wheel well feels like being a kid on Christmas morning. I've had this suspension sitting and waiting for this moment for almost a year at this point, and to know that I'm only a week or two away from having the parts I need to finally get the suspension installed for good into the M3 feels like I'm mere moments away from experiencing an entirely new car. However, right now, it is still a waiting game, so let's shift our focus away from how these look in the car and instead look at what I was talking about at the very beginning of the episode. Now you'll have to excuse the shaky camera as it's pretty difficult to hold the camera in one hand and spin the wheel with the other, but hopefully it's pretty clear what's going on. Now I knew going into this that I wasn't going to be able to fit my wheel setup on the car without some sort of spacer on the car, and so what you're seeing now is the gap I have with a 17.5mm spacer installed, which even at that width, you could see it's a pretty tight fit, although one we could definitely work with. Now I'm going to save my thoughts for the end of the episode as there were a few other things I figured out that ended up being pretty crucial and important to know regarding the install of the Clubsport suspension. Things that I hadn't anticipated but I'm really glad I figured out, as they would have likely prevented me from installing the suspension had I not temporarily installed this coilover today. So instead, before pulling out the KW coilover and reinstalling my OEM suspension, really quick, I'd like to see what the fitment is like with the 17.5mm spacer and with some height taken out of this front corner. I think pleased would be the wrong word for how I'm feeling right now. The car looks amazing, or at least this front corner does. The fitment isn't necessarily perfect, whatever that even means for a track car, but it is undeniably better than how it's been in its OEM form, and that's without adjusting camber. So I think it's safe to say that the coilover test fit project ended up panning out to not only be much needed, but insanely motivational, because I want to get these coilovers on permanently. In fact, I need to. Now lastly, before getting into today's recap, I do need to reinstall the OEM suspension, install the X-Brace, and get the M3 back on the ground. So if you'd like to stick around for the next minute or so while I do that, feel free. Otherwise, press the L button on your keyboard a couple of times and I'll see you for the recap. All right, the X-Brace is officially installed. It is permanently put in the car and I'm super stoked on that, but I did want to quickly recap everything I figured out regarding the test fit of this KW coilover, because I ended up with a lot more information than I planned on going into this episode, and I want to recap for anybody who plans on putting KWs on your E36. So essentially, I originally went into today's video trying to figure out what size spacer I was going to need, because when you install KW coilovers on your E36, unless you have aftermarket wheels with different offsets, if you're running stock wheels, there's a pretty good chance you're gonna have fitment issues between the wheel and tire and the coil itself. And so I was trying to figure out what size spacer I was gonna need, because before making this video, I was actually just gonna send it on buying whatever spacers I thought I was gonna need. And it ended up working out to my benefit doing this instead, because what I figured out was that this 17.5mm spacer is pretty much perfect. Could probably get away with a 15mm spacer, but I think for now, just so I don't have to buy other ones, I'm gonna run the 17.5mm one and go from there. Now, regarding what else I learned from doing this is that, for one, my car came with these strut tower reinforcement plates already. These are new ones I bought way back because I didn't think my car had them, but good to know I have an extra set. But what I also learned is that this hole right here is not big enough to allow access to all of the bolts on top of this coilover to adjust camber. So I am gonna have to modify this a little bit to be able to have full access, because if I don't, I'm gonna have to take this off every time I want to adjust camber, and that doesn't make any sense. So I did learn that. And lastly, I also learned that the OEM sway bar end links on my car, I guess, are too long. I'm gonna need adjustable sway bar end links to be able to fit sway bar end links on my car, because if I try to run the OEM ones, the bottom part of the sway bar end link is gonna make contact with the lower control arm, because where the mounting tab is on these coilovers, it's further down than the OEM ones, and so the sway bar end link ends up sitting further down, and then it makes contact with the lower control arm. So all in all, this ended up being a very worthwhile episode, at least for me, for information's sake. It's gonna save me a lot of time and effort knowing this going into the actual install versus trying to figure it out while I'm installing it. That would have really made the episode that I plan on doing to install these a pain to do if I hadn't known that stuff. So now I can prepare properly, I could order the right parts, and I could modify these before actually trying to start the install. So super excited. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. I know it was a little different. We did install one part, which is cool, but you know, as far as like the technical stuff goes and trying to kind of figure things out before they happen, which is not usually how things go on this channel, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. It's kind of a new idea for me, and if you guys enjoyed it, maybe I'll do more stuff, you know, just try to give more information and more detail on the build in general. But yeah, let me know in the comments. But at this point, I'm rambling. If you made it this far in the video, I appreciate you checking it out, and I look forward to catching you guys in the next episode. Thank you for watching. Peace.